but I think I thank Professor Neera, Ashis and Anup for this really taking the trouble of going through the volume and actually looking at the posers and the kind of signposts the volume tries to put in that. That I think the question of political subjectivity has become too fluid for us to capture. The old categories are simply failing us repeatedly in terms of, and that's where we are trying to repeatedly raise, and this is a task we are doing in the classroom every day, trying to understand the fluidity in political subjectivity. The ideas of mobility, ideas of dignity, ideas of stigma, ideas of agency. I think all of them are undergoing very drastic transformation. They're all become very fluid for us to capture through the categories that we know in terms of the ideological frameworks, in terms of structure versus process, so on and so forth. And therefore, what is very interesting with the Maoist movement in the current context, it seems to be running in the opposite direction with uncertainty. There is some, when you meet and talk to those related to Maoist movement, they seem to be living in a world of certain certainty, which sort of eludes all of us. You know, we are becoming increasingly skeptical of things, of categories. We think of category mistakes that we are committing. So that sets an interesting question in democracy, that how should one look at this certainty that Maoists continue to bear, and that comes from the kind of question that Anup raised, that question of certainty of death, that politics, that the preparedness to die, the idea of sacrifice. Where does that will come from, especially in the current form of a porous democracy that we are living in? I think that's one question that interested me, that how do they mobilize its social location, so on and so forth. The other part is that obviously the categories, as we know, and also as Neera has put it, that democracy theory has turned, because today we are talking of revolutionary violence in the context of democracy. I think in that mode, quite a few categories, the way we have known, are turning on their head. And that's the poser I end with my conclusion between populism and revolution. That populism is less intensive but more inclusive. Now our old 70s language, Satish would know, we were all studying Marxism. We thought the idea of the structural was the most inclusive. Today the language of structural has become exclusive, because it has become so narrow. And that's one problem that the revolutionary language is facing. The idea of revolution itself is facing, is that the more of structural analysis that Maoists make, the more clinical is their analysis, it seems to exclude more number of social subaltern groups. This is something that has turned after the 90s. Since populism is more porous, since populism is open to much of empty categories like corruption, it becomes more inclusive, and it also becomes more empowering. I think to capture subaltern agency today, we cannot capture simply through that structure process binary, structure agency binary. We all read Giddens and Alex Kelly-Kos and this old 70s sociologists that we all read. I think today it's become too porous for us, for those categories, to capture any of this. And that's why I think the question that Anup raised, that there is an inclusion within exclusion. And that's, I think, the thing that we are continuously discussing in our classrooms of institutions. That institutions, when do they become sites of mobilization, and when do institutions become the targets of those mobilizations? Do we have the privilege of making these distinctions? And from what vantage point do we make these distinctions? Does institutional language itself represent a certain social privilege? Now, this is another question we are continuously debating, that that does such an institutional language itself represent, and what about that political subjectivity which wishes to question and extend the logic of institutions? Do institutions have the tenacity? And therefore it's a question of democracy, that does democracy, can it really survive this kind of a counter, if you might say, counter revolution of the subalterns? So therefore there are a range of questions where we are our categories are really failing us in terms of understanding the notions of subaltern mobility. And I thought, posing this question of revolutionary violence versus democracy, and you have rightly referred to Uday's article, which tries to, I think, deal with that question through ethnographic work, is that it's not a binary, but it's some kind of fluid continuity, that it's a moving backward and forward. And therefore I think there is something that we have to go beyond And even the latest Nobel laureate now has won for economics. He talks about logic beyond rationality. And that's the reason he's won. That there is not between rational and irrational. That he's trying to look at logic beyond the rational. That there is something beyond the rational choice. You said, Anup, that I think Ashis was also making that point, that everything is getting reduced to rational choice. But there's something else that's also happening in populism. That it's moving, yeah, exactly, it's moving beyond rational choice. And therefore, in discussing the idea of populism, we are bringing in categories of emotions, we are bringing in categories of anxiety, hate, anomie, all of these categories which we'll have to now understand subaltern mobility. And third, what is the question of agency? Now I think how do we link the question of agency to structural mobility? Is subaltern really looking for structural mobility? That's the question. I think revolution speaks in the language of structural mobility, and I think that's the question that Maoist movement is continuously facing, between the link between party and the people. For quite some time they equated party with the people. Today we are increasingly raising this question that it in itself is a kind of an hegemonic appropriation to say that party represents the people. Instead we are arguing that party has a long-term structural goal, and people, including Adivasis, subalterns, Dalits, farmers, landless, come with the revolutionary project for their own reasons, which do not carry forward all the way to a grand structural rupture. I think this realization has made us see that revolution itself can turn on its head. And this is a question that Balgopal raises. Anup, you missed summarizing Balgopal's piece. I was looking forward to your comments on Balgopal's piece, where he makes some very fascinating observation that there is something in the sociology of violence, of revolutionary violence, that it always turns against the subaltern that it's mobilized, against its own social base. I think the point even Anira makes in terms of why after 3 years, that why does this happen? What is in the logic of the revolutionary violence that it often turns, it kills more of its own social base than the enemies. This is a point that Balgopal raises, that what is in the sociology of physiognomy of the violence, revolutionary violence, that it happens. And we need to find answers for these questions. As you rightly pointed out, I hope I've tried to sort of avoid this binary between revolutionary violence and democracy. And these questions some of the questions that the book, I think are not relevant just in the context of revolutionary violence. I think these have some generic implications for understanding political subjectivity in the current context. That the last poser I make between populism and failed revolutions, populist democracies and failed revolutions, I think pose this range of these questions which are very, very interesting, and I don't think they are in a dialogue today. That populist democracies are increasingly looking inclusive, increasingly giving modes of new kinds of mobility, and revolutionary violence are becoming, revolutions are becoming increasingly exclusive and structured. And we had the privilege in 70s and 80s to think that structural language is the one that goes deep in terms of kind of ruptural transformation, but that doesn't seem to be the case today. The more of structural language does become more of exclusion and more of an hegemony, and more of a top-down. So this also becomes where ideological frameworks become increasingly normative, while reality seems to be too messy for us to capture through those frames. How do we then capture that messy reality outside pragmatism? One is to reduce it to pragmatism, one is to reduce it to just an everydayness. There is a mismatch between these micro foundations of politics and macro structural theories. One way is to reduce it to pragmatic choices. I think that's one problem we found with Chatterjee's formulation of political society, that it simply reduces to that everyday choices beyond any context, and it shows that the new kind of agency is all about this kind of pragmatism. So there is pragmatism that we are finding in subaltern politics all across the board. All forms of subaltern politics today have taken a pragmatic route, and I think this is a daily discussions I have with our students in classrooms and in my room, how to understand this pragmatism. Movement from right to left, left to center. People are willing to move. I think we are stuck in our rooms, but people are willing to be more mobile. Subaltern politics are willing to be more mobile. And that mobility comes with an idea of upward mobility. The lateral mobility between frames comes with a notion of upward mobility. One one hesitates to celebrate this pragmatism when one looks at questions of democracy, justice, revolution, social transformation and all of that. How do we stitch this growing pragmatism of the subaltern politics with transformative politics? Post-colonialism, I think, has made an easy choice of reducing transformation to pragmatism. That there is some transformation possible through pragmatic choices, which is true, which is one cannot deny. But is there something more? And is there something more that, and in that sense, I think the project of revolution gives us a signpost that there's something human beings also. I think that's one issue that even Anup very closely dealt with your Marxism and spirituality. That the project of social ethics outside the political. That how do you bring in the notion of social ethics without they becoming hegemonic in terms of putting certain normative standards as a baseline for subaltern politics. I think these are highly complex and confusing. We have been looking at the issue from all dimensions. That politics without social ethics, where does it take you? Politics of social ethics as hegemonic politics, what do they block? And therefore subaltern politics, I think, of various kinds are raising and foregrounding these issues, and they're, I think, extremely important for us to keep our ear to the ground to really know that language of institutions, language of democracy, how it is going to turn, and much of it is turning on its head. I think as Ashis Nandy was referring to the rise of Modi and Donald Trump, I think these are certain moments of backlash. Moments of backlash that have happened because we have missed something on the ground. We have missed to certain category. I think we have made certain category mistakes in terms of understanding this backlash, and which to some extent I think right has a better position to mobilize much of this. Whether it is herd pride of the upper caste, whether it is the undoing of the stigma of the subaltern caste, and this is a question that continuously now interesting me, that what is it that the right has got it right, which has left has being left out. And this is a question that interests, and therefore I make this formulation of left Brahmin and right Bahujan. There is something in the mass politics which the right is getting it right, and left is getting receded precisely because of its scientific language of structural nature, which we cannot do away with, but the way left is pursuing it, I think, is increasingly becoming narrow enough to exclude the majority. And what else do you replace this language with without going down the path of the right-wing pragmatism? And as Nandi said, lynchings, I think, are one important signpost for us. I think it's a question that continuously interests me, and therefore this question of violence and culture, various issues that you have referred, and you have referred to quite a few interesting issues of capital, state, centralization, and how do we respond to that centralization of the state. I think John Holloway has done some work on that, gardens and communities of protest. I don't know whether India, one can have the privileges of those dissipated, localized struggles as one model of response to the, we don't know as yet. These questions, I think, have to come, and one of the things the volume tries to do is to put in academics and practitioners, activists of various kinds together. And as many of us now realizing that academic language does not really capture the entire picture. The academic language captures only a partial picture, and therefore we'll have to step outside the academic language. It could be fiction, it could be literature, it could be autobiographies, it could be various other forms through which we'll have to try and capture this fluidity. But what this shows is that there is a certain fluidity for which we'll have to develop new categories. And I hope this book, in that sense, makes an attempt to sort of make, at least give an entry point for the debate to further. So I again thank Anup, Professor Chandok and Ashis for this wonderful presentation. I think the presentations have been much better than my book and the introduction. I think they draw in more depth than the introduction actually has. So I'm really thankful, and if you pose more dilemmas, then I can dare you that you might have to suffer another book from me. So I think we should conclude here before one.
This is just in response, just 1 second. I think Ajay has pointed out a very important dilemma, very important condition that assails political science, discipline of political science, and that is we no longer have certainties. Politics is contingent, it is chancy, it is happenstance. And I want to end, because Ajay ended with dilemma, with just quoting a small incident, which has been narrated by the philosopher Bimal Matilal. He talks about the fact of dilemmas, and he illustrates this whole paradox by reference to a story in the Mahabharata. Mahabharata is a compendium of very many tales. There is a hermit, not a sage, a hermit called Kausika, who has vowed always to tell the truth because he wants to go to heaven. So one day he's standing at a crossroads and he finds a group of travelers running by, and he finds them being pursued by bandits. Now the bandits knew Kausika's vows, so they asked him which way did the travelers go, and he said this way. So they pursued him, killed the travelers and robbed them, and Kausika did not go to heaven. So Bimal Matilal poses it very well. He says, see, here it was a dilemma between ahimsa and satya, both of which are very important in all the ancient texts, because satya raksha, truth protection, is as important as ahimsa. Ahimsa is the first virtue. But you are constantly being faced with dilemmas. There is no easy ordering like Kant would have you say, or like the 10 commandments. 10 commandments, first commandment, thou shalt have no other God besides me. I've always wondered where this notion of dharam, sambhav goes when it's faced with Christianity. They don't believe in all paths lead to the truth, neither does Islam. But coming back to the story, he says it doesn't mean that you do not make intelligent decisions. What you need is, you need imagination. Now Kausika could have kept quiet, or he could have said, I know but I will not tell you. So it doesn't mean a paralysis of thinking. It means that we have to think afresh. We have to recognize that the world, the political world, is full of irreconcilable dilemmas. And we have to come up with new, but there are no laws of nature, there are no stages of growth. We were brought up in, we did BA and MA in Delhi University, only one way out, revolution.
Loss of motion.
What? We used to attend Ranjit's classes in history, and we were so fired, the revolution, and then you have, all these revolutions petering off into state despotism. And in a way, I think political science has become a more exciting subject. We've got out of structuralism. And we've got into the realm of thinking about our dilemmas. And one of the dilemmas Ajay has posed very well. How is it that the Hindu knife has caught hold of the what do you call it now? The arteries of community life in India, because you find these guys there in every neighborhood. See a movie called Dam Laga Ke Haisha. He's an RSS Pracharak, Ayushman Khurrana, and when they have a problem, these guys are there to help them solve it. So in a way the left is probably into elitist, to enter into personal lives of people. So in a way we have to think, we have to imagine, innovate. I hate using a word that is being used. I'm not talking about skill India. I'm talking about tapping imagination to look in directions that had crippled political science up till now. If I can learn it at the stage of my career, so can you.